I'm going to get started and kick things off. My name is Hayley Watts. I am one of the Productivity Ninja team at Think Productive. I've been a Productivity Ninja for 10 years now, which is quite exciting. We are an organisation that help people with task management, managing high volumes of emails, high volumes of work, too many meetings, as well as doing lots of different sessions around leadership and culture, organisations and teams, whole variety of different things. And our project management training is one of the newer additions to our lineup. We're going to talk specifically today about engaging stakeholders. And I've been asked recently, in fact, Dee and I had a call with a prospective client yesterday, and we were talking about the difference between project management and task management. The two complement each other really nicely. I think task management is about how we do our work, how we get the tasks done, how we feel like we're moving forward towards our bigger goals, and how we manage a high volume of different things that we need to do and think about and might have in our minds at any time. Whereas project management is taking a step back and maybe more strategic overview and look at the work that we're doing. Clients will very often book our project management session alongside our How to Be a Productivity Ninja session, which is more around task management. Anything to add to that? So I'm joined by Dee, who's our client success manager at Think Productive. Dee, is there anything else to add to that kind of distinction between project management and task management?
I just think of it as task management is everything I need to do,
Yeah.
and that can include things like booking a train ticket, like everything that's swimming in my brain. Whereas the project management is a single project with a clear objective and a team around it, maybe a
Absolutely.
budget. And of course, the tricky bit is when you have lots of projects running at the same time along different train tracks.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but just a quick note to say that I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So any kind of questions or logistical issues, feel free if anyone wants to message me directly.
Thanks, Dee. So we're going to get stuck into project management essential, as it says there, engaging your stakeholders. The success of any project can often depend on the engagement and the alignment of stakeholders. And when I'm delivering our project management training, this is one of the things that people often say, this is really hard because the rest of the stuff is within my control. But how the other people engage with the project, that feels more difficult. It's outside my immediate control, and therefore it can feel a bit different. So there are some things that we talk about in our project management training that I think it would be useful to think about. And whenever we go into an organisation and do this kind of one-day introduction to project management course, people will talk about they feel like they're juggling a lot, right? They've got a lot on. There's, like Dee says, there's lots of different projects that they might be working on at the same time. There's often a tension between the project work, the big strategic important projects, and the business as usual type work. So I like to think of this, people often talk about, I feel like I'm spinning too many plates. So just picture for a moment, if you will, people spinning plates and trying to keep all these different plates spinning on one of those, I don't know, whatever it is that people spin plates on. Some of those plates, if they fall, are going to break and they're not going to be able to be repaired. Some of those plates might be paper disposable plates, and we can get rid of them, and it's not ideal, but that's how it is. It's not the end of the world. Some of the plates might be made out of some kind of plastic material, so they fall to the floor and they don't break, they just sit on the floor for a bit. And we can come and pick those plates up again and start spinning them again when we are ready to. We might replace some of the paper plates that have been missing, that have dropped to the floor. But those glass or delicate china plates are things that are much more difficult to repair. And I love this quote here from Warren Buffett. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. Thinking about the things that matter in our projects and the things that are more difficult to fix when they break, if those glass plates fall to the floor. It's often the relationships with other people. It's often our ability to interact with our stakeholders, our ability to get them on board and be trusted with the people engaged in our projects that makes a difference, and really easy to damage that reputation. So I thought it was good to take a little look at that quote there. If you can't communicate your idea in a way that a customer understands, it's not a good idea. The stakeholders engaged in your project have to get it. They have to value it. And I know in my own experience, when I used to run an organisation and we had lots of different projects running at any different time, sometimes it felt like really hard work to engage some of our key stakeholders and get them really interested and as enthused and excited in some of the projects that we were working on as we were. And one of the things that I think I learned was the importance of understanding where your different stakeholders are coming from, what's important to them, and communicating to them in a way that emphasises the areas where what you're doing overlaps with their areas of interest. So we're going to have a little look at this stakeholder analysis tool, which I'm sure if you're involved in managing projects, you may have come across before, but there are a few things I want to say about this. So we've got our level of stakeholder interest along the bottom there. And then we've got the stakeholder influence and power going at the top. So if something is down here, we've got relatively low power and relatively low levels of interest. Those are the stakeholders, but there's perhaps the least importance, maybe minimal effort happening there. Then we move into this next area where there's a low level of power, but a high level of interest. So I'm trying to think what that might look like. My son's school, for example, as a parent, I've got relatively little power over what goes on at school, but I have got quite a high level of interest. So show consideration, keep informed is the kind of the guidance for people who might sit in that space. Up on the top here, we've got people who've got a high level of power, but perhaps not that interested in the project. Maybe there's somebody higher up in the organisation at a more strategic level, or a decision maker where this project isn't top of their list of priorities. We need to meet their needs and keep them satisfied, but that involves us understanding their needs to be able to do that. And then over here, we've got a slightly different group, high power and high interest. Key players engage closely. So they might be partner organisations if you're working on a project together. They might be clients, perhaps. They could be a whole mixture of different people. And I'm using these labels for a group of people, parents, senior decision makers, clients. That's quite generic. So if you're doing a stakeholder analysis for your area of work, I would encourage you to think about who are the internal stakeholders, who are the external stakeholders, and plotting them on this 4x4 grid. Now, somebody might be down at the very bottom there with low power, low interest, but maybe there are other groups of stakeholders who are, instead of being at the bottom left of that square, they're maybe at the top right. They've got low level power and low level interest, but more than some others. So I've mentioned some groups of people, clients, senior managers. Your line manager perhaps is more in that top right-hand corner, high power, high interest. So although some people might fit into a general group, clients, prospective clients, senior managers, there might also be some individuals who sit in a slightly different space to the rest of their peer group, if you like. So you might have some clients who are low power, high interest, and other individuals who might be higher power, high interest within that organisation. So I always encourage people when we're working through the stakeholder analysis to be thinking about where do those groups of people sit within this framework? Are there any individuals that belong to that group, but actually their power or their interest is higher or lower? Put those names in, include those people, go into a higher level of detail.
Hayley, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, what we got?
Would you add the term responsibility to this model?
Ooh.
Some have no interest but high responsibility. That's that's how we need to talk
Yeah.
workshop, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, and I'm wondering if those people with high responsibility have high power. I'm wondering if that's a similar thing, or if there might be some people with high responsibility but lower power. I'm not sure. So I'm wondering if the word responsibility sounds different to power, but I'm wondering if that responsibility in some circumstances might equate to power. And somebody said that, yeah, I think it can vary. Yeah, so that's interesting. So you could add an additional element to this around responsibility. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. That's really helpful. So when you're looking at this stakeholder analysis and where the groups of people or the individuals sit, I would encourage you to do that first time in terms of where are they today, right? Where are they sat in this grid right now? You might then have a look, are there any people that you would like to move along that grid? So, for example, within the voluntary and statutory sector organisations, there is perhaps a move towards giving people who use those services or engage with those services, benefit from them, higher levels of power by devolving some of the responsibility and decision making to those key players. So they're moving from high interest, low power up into that higher power, high interest section. So thinking about where are they now, but where would you like them to be? Maybe you'd like them to be somewhere different. So just inviting you to share in the chat any stakeholders where you've got them in one place, but you want to move them to a different place. And I'm interested to know, where do you want to move them from and to? And you can just tell us in terms of the colours if that's easier. You might say, I want them to move from green to pink or something else. So just give you a moment to share that. I don't know if we've had any other questions coming through while people are having a think about that, Dee.
No questions
Can't see
yet.
any, no.
I was thinking about what's the trickiest one, and
Yeah,
I'm thinking maybe the green is the tricky one.
that's
Um,
interesting because I often think the pink is the
Mm.
tricky one.
Yeah,
People who are
I just
high
yeah.
interest but don't have much power.
Yeah. Or anything, I think maybe anything with low interest, because that's down to
Yes.
motivation, isn't it? That's your engagement. That's
Yeah.
harder to correct. Lots of lots of people in the chat. Purple to blue seems a very popular one as a
Yes.
hard one. So the
Yeah.
people with the power, but getting them from low interest to high interest.
Yeah. I've moved slides there. I didn't mean to. So yeah, that people with high power, we want those people, those decision makers, to be really interested and engaged in our work. I remember working as a CEO in a charity quite a while ago now, and a lot of the high-powered decision makers, the people who held the purse strings and in some cases commissioned the work that we did, they were kind of high power, low interest. And we worked really hard on moving them into that high power, high interest space by really focusing on what are the messages we want these people to be hearing from us? How do we get consistent with those messages? And rather than being weighted and invited to come and tell them more about the project and the things we wanted to tell them about, we found ways to find out what is it that they're interested in? How do we tie our motivations into their motivations? What's that common ground? How might we do that? I can see lots of thoughts coming through in the chat now, so I'm just going to take a moment to quick skim of those. Moving from pink to green is a good aim for a regulator. When interacting with members of the public, they lose interest once you have built trust and credibility. That's interesting. Yeah. And that sounds like it's very specific to that kind of regulator organisation role, which makes sense, right? Because once trust has been established and credibility, then perhaps there's less for people to engage with. Their questions are answered, they're happy, they're satisfied. Sometimes it's difficult to know if your supporter has the power, even if they have the interest. That's a very interesting point. Thank you for sharing that. And there are different ways we can look at and assess that, and we may not know until it comes to crunch making decision time. So each of these different sections is going to need a different strategy for how you communicate with those people. If people are already in high power, high interest in that blue square, how are you going to keep them there? I did this training course with a team a couple of months ago, and their key decision maker was right, top right hand corner of that blue box, right where you want them to be. High power, high interest, really supportive of the piece of work. But that person was moving on to a different role soon. You're now starting at the beginning again, perhaps bringing people through that journey. They start off with high power, but they might have a relatively low interest. This was a piece of work that the individual sponsoring it was passionate about, but everybody else in their kind of peer group within the organisation sat much further over to the left in terms of their interest levels. So as individuals change, you may need to have a strategy to bring somebody new on board and moving them into that high power, high interest space quickly. Lovely point in the chat. Beware of hidden power too. Some people have friends in high places. That sounds like an observation shared through some well-gained experience. And sometimes you're not aware of the potential impact. Absolutely, stakeholders aren't always supporters. And I can think of an example where this has been the case in some work that I was doing when I was on a board, a charity board, a trustee board for a charity. And stakeholders that weren't supportive, who were probably in the top of the green box in terms of their power, actually they would have been pink, low power, high interest, but not supportive, interested in a perhaps less positive and constructive way. And one of the things we did there, the chair of the organisation was thinking about strategies. How do we move this person out of the organisation? They're becoming problematic. They're not engaging with us. They're not behaving in the way we want our stakeholders to behave. But some of us on the board had a slightly different view, and we said, look, they're interested. They've got a high level of interest. How do we work with them on this? There's somebody who's accessing the service. They might not be happy, but they're allowed to not be happy. If their experience hasn't been good, how do we as a trustee board learn from that? How do we engage them? And we actually ended up having one or two of those people on the trustee board. We actually gave them more power. And that worked out really well. One of them became one of the best trustees that organisation had ever had, because their level of interest was so high. They were passionate about it. They really cared about it. So we were able to learn and understand from their experience. So that person had definitely moved from high interest, low power, and we worked with them to give them more power, which eventually I think led to the organisation delivering much better services as a result. That person was quite critical, but by giving them a space in which to be critical more constructively, that made a big difference and brought a number of other stakeholders along with them as well. Because they did have supporters, but weren't necessarily supportive. And that's a subtle difference, but an important difference, I think. And I've just seen the comment there in the chat, are the blue more like unicorns? So if you're feeling like the unicorn is the blue space, want to encourage you to think, who would you like to be in that space? And start to think about putting some strategies together to make some changes there. The reasons for people resisting change, resisting buying in to your project and your area of work can often seem quite complex. I kind of think they boil down to three main things. People are busy. I know that as a productivity ninja because I go into lots of organisations and help people to manage their high workloads. People feel busy. People often have to say no to things that they might like to get involved with if they had more time, if there was more people, if there were more resources. but they haven't got the capacity to do that right now. So for your project, it may come across that those people are disengaged and not interested, and that they're down in that green square. But actually, maybe they have a bit more interest than you thought. They're just busy with other things, and it's not their priority right now. So that might change your strategy in terms of how you deal with them. Sometimes a lot of projects will involve things changing, right? If you're delivering a project, something's going to change at the end of it. And people can feel resistant to that. They might feel a bit uncertain. We don't quite know what to expect of this, so we want to stick with the status quo. And that's where it's important to take into account things like decision fatigue. If you're asking somebody to make a change and you ask them towards the end of the day, the theory around decision fatigue suggests that they're less likely to do that because it's the end of the day and they've already made lots of decisions throughout the day. Their capacity for decision making is lower towards the end of the day than the beginning of the day. So you may want to think about that too. It might be that people have got different goals, different priorities, but also different goals. What they're looking to achieve is slightly different to what you're looking to achieve. Or your project is this big and they're only interested in a small part of it because that's the part that impacts and affects them. So the reasons for resistance can be quite complex. So you need to think about, in relation to each of your stakeholders, how do I tap in to their goals? How do I make this higher up their priority list? And so a few things we might want to think about in terms of managing some of that resistance. Thinking about how we listen to people, often we can fill in the blanks, we can make assumptions. And one of the things we talk about in our Coaching to Empower session is how do we improve rather than prove? Sometimes if somebody comes to you and they say something that you're not entirely thrilled to hear, you can feel that your need to justify and prove yourself comes to the forefront. But if we take a step back and listen with curiosity and with interest to find out more, we can often learn more that helps us to improve what we're doing and overcome some of that resistance rather than just justifying the decisions that we've made and the changes that are happening. Sometimes it can be hard to find the common ground, but we can do that again through the listening, through looking at what are people interested in, what aspect of our project is capturing their interests. Once you've found that common ground, you can start to build on it a little bit more. That can take time. That involves spending a bit more time talking to people, listening to them, finding out what's going on. It might be that you don't have as much power as you might like in this particular situation. Who has the ear of the person that you're trying to capture their interest and reduce their resistance? Are there other people that you can get on board with what you're trying to do? People who can be allies for you, people who can advocate and support the work that you're doing. And that might make a difference to the person that you're looking to reduce their resistance and engage them further. Thinking about how do you start small? How do you go with low-level commitments? How do you make it easy for people? If people are too busy and they're a bit resistant to change, how do we just make it easy for them? So rather than saying, actually, we think we should completely change this service and the way we deliver this part of our work, how do you test that out? How do you pilot it? How do you start small so you can learn from any mistakes that you're going to make to justify perhaps or research what it is that you're looking to achieve and what the impact and the outcomes might be. Another thing, yeah, buy them a coffee in the morning. That sounds good. I've got them there in the chat. Another thing to think about in your relationships with your stakeholders in all four categories is what are the different lines of communication that people would like to use for a project. So it might be that you prefer phone calls and text messages, weekly debriefs, Slack and Asana are your preferred communication methods, but what they want to use is WhatsApp. The weekly debrief is a common ground, so like build on that. Slack is a common ground, but they want to use Trello while you're using Asana. So how do we overcome that tension in the different tools that you might prefer to use? This comes up a lot in organizations where some people will send an email, they don't get a reply as quickly as they might want to their email. So then they send a Teams message and they don't get a reply to that either. So then they start phoning or WhatsApping people to get a response straight away. But if you've got agreement with your stakeholders, like if I need something from you urgently, this is the platform I will use to contact you. Then that starts to reduce some of the friction in those working relationships. Also having conversations with people to say, how do you prefer for me to communicate with you? Like Dee knows that if she wants me to respond to something today, it's a WhatsApp message and I'll be on it. Anything else, it's going to have to wait till tomorrow, maybe even the day after, depending on what's going on in my calendar. And we can ask people about this. Sometimes if you're looking to engage somebody and build a relationship, just asking them what they would prefer in terms of how you communicate with them and how often you communicate with them and about what in relation to your project can really help set a common ground and common understanding among your stakeholder group. Mistakes are going to happen in the work that you're doing. They're inevitable, aren't they? So when we make a mistake, or if our stakeholders make a mistake, we want to learn from that and communicate that with our stakeholders as soon as possible. So sometimes that might be acknowledging, hey, we made a mistake, but this is what we've done to try and fix it. This is what we've learned, and being open and honest about that. I think that's a great quote, backing up that kind of point about mistakes. If you're expecting to deliver a project over a period of time and not make any mistakes and not getting anything wrong, you're not being very realistic. Like, how do you support yourself? How do you support your stakeholders and the people around you to be able to make mistakes and share that learning across the team? That's really important. We've got time for some questions. So if you want to head to the Q&A section, we'd love to hear some questions for you. I've gone through that. Actually, that's, yeah, well, we're doing right where we want to be in terms of time. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. That's a great idea there for how we display that information differently in the stakeholder analysis. We'll make sure we pick that up. Thank you. So the Q&A section is open. Please do head there and share your questions. I'm going to have a little look through the chat to see if there's any questions there to pull out. Yeah, if we had an app for telepathy, wouldn't that be fun? And there's kind of a comment there around buying people a coffee. Sometimes when we're building these stakeholder relationships, it is about just meeting someone for a chat rather than a formal meeting. I'm sure we have lots of those in relation to the projects that we worked with. We've not really touched on that. How do we drag stakeholders kicking and screaming to commit to taking action? Good question. One of the things to think about is what's motivating them. Like, what's their engagement and what are the common ground factors? Can you build on those to help them take action? In our session, the 4 tendencies, we talk about different people's styles and perhaps their motivations for doing things that they're asked to. Some people are highly likely to do something if you ask them to. Other people are highly likely not to. So there might be some things to bring in there as well. But the important thing to remember is you can't ultimately make somebody else do something. In her book, Dare to Lead, Brené Brown talks about people putting marbles in each other's jars. The marbles is the level of trust, I guess, that you build, the relationship that you build. Each time you interact with someone, you have an opportunity to put a marble in their jar or for them to take a marble out of your jar to build or to decrease the trust that you have with that person. So if you've built a better relationship, you're going to have a better understanding of what's likely to move them into action. But also, they might be more likely to take action for you because that's the kind of relationship that you might have. Ultimately, we can't make people do things they don't want to do. And that's hard, but that's how it is. So we need to think about how do we build those relationships and get curious if they're not taking action. How do we ask questions? How do we learn what's going on? It's really easy to just get frustrated that people aren't doing what you want them to do. But we need to dig deeper. We need to learn and understand why. Next question, have you got any suggestions on the best way just to engage stakeholders? I think that's a question to ask your stakeholders because it's going to be different. Right? What engages me and captures my energy, my interest, my attention, might be different to what captures my friend Sally's energy, interest, and attention. So I think the best way to engage different stakeholders is go and ask them. You know, this is the project, this is the area of work, this is how it overlaps with what you're doing. How do you want to be involved? What does your involvement look like in an ideal world? Let's go and find out. Let's go and ask them rather than making assumptions and second guessing. And it's hard to do. You might feel a bit vulnerable doing that. They may turn around and say, do you know what? I'm not interested in your project and your work at all. Okay, no worries. What are you interested in this kind of general broad area? That helps you to find the common ground. How do you make sure you're on track in terms of timelines and getting people to keep their deadlines? So no project management training would be complete, I think, without a Gantt chart. So that's where I'd suggest you kind of head to in terms of keeping track of the timeline. And in terms of getting people to keep to their deadlines, as I say, you can't make someone do something. You've got to motivate them to want to do something. So tapping into their motivations, asking questions, saying, I need this from you. It would be really helpful to me if you're able to get it to me by the end of February. Is that realistic? Is that something you're going to be able to help me with? And if they say no, you might have to change what you need from them. You might say, okay, well, could you do a bit less by the end of February? Or what could you do within this time frame? Or you may need to go somewhere else. And we've got another question there. What about setting expectations? Absolutely. Setting expectations is really important. What can people expect of you? Right, if you're not meeting the deadlines and you're not doing the things in the time frame that you've been asked to do, people are much less likely to do that when you're asking for the information or actions from them. Don't be shy about setting expectations. We talk a lot about expectation management in our different varied sessions around communication, whether it's inbox to zero or supercharge your team communications. When we're setting expectations, we want to be clear, we want to ask questions, we want to let people know what they can expect from working with us. What is that going to look like? I used to be part of quite a big project when I was working with a local authority around increasing the number of people engaged in grassroots sports, which for anybody who knows me is highly hysterical, because that's not somewhere I spend a huge amount of my time. But being involved in this particular group, the chair of the group was really clear about his expectations. He literally said, don't come to the project meeting if you haven't done your actions from the last meeting. Take that time that's in your calendar where you would have been in the meeting to make sure the actions are done by the time the meeting finishes. Like, that was quite scary. That was quite boundaried in terms of what his expectations were. If you're involved in the group, that's what you signed up to doing. But everybody was clear on that and everybody prioritised those actions, and that project moved forward like really quickly and effectively because those expectations had been set at the outset. You may not have the power to do that in the context of the work that you're doing, but you can have a think about what your expectations are. You can have conversations about that and make that clear to other people. I think people appreciate that clarity as well. I'm just looking to, that's all the questions we have in the Q&A. So we have got time for a few more. And I'm just having a little look to see if we've got any other questions in the chat. I've not spotted any. I love top tip here from Jennifer. Never underestimate the power of bringing a packet of biscuits to a meeting. But our meetings are often online now, so maybe that packet of biscuits needs to go in the post beforehand. Okay, give you a moment to see if you've got any further questions, if there's anything we can help you with. In fact, we'll come back to the questions in a moment. So if anybody has any questions, you've still got time to pop them into the Q&A section there. It might be that you want to find out a bit more about the workshops that we deliver. We do a Project Management 101 session We work through building a project right from the beginning, and it's a very practical session. So we're not looking at case studies and hypothetical situations. We are looking at your project, your work, and we put a project plan in place. So you will have spent the day working on your project, as well as learning tools and techniques that you can apply to other projects in the future. We've got a session coming up in a couple of weeks' time, Mastering Team Communications for Culture Building. Some examples of how to use Slack like a professional. That's our default communication channel at Think Productive. We don't send each other internal emails. So there's a QR code there so you can find out a bit more about these sessions. We've got a public workshop coming up starting in a couple of weeks. It's 2 hours a week for 6 weeks, and it's our 6 weeks to Ninja session. And this is an annual event being run by our founder and author of the best-selling book, How to Be a Productivity Ninja. So that's with Graham. I highly recommend it. It's life-changing. We've got another question come through. I like the idea of using the 4 tendencies to help when engaging stakeholders. Would love to hear a bit more about that if there's time. So the 4 tendencies is a model developed by Gretchen Rubin, and Gretchen talks about people have different responses to being asked to do something, or indeed deciding if they're going to do something for themselves. So some people are more likely to do something if somebody else asks them to. Some people are really good at sticking to their commitments and their boundaries and find it really easy to say yes or no to things. Other people need to know a bit more about why they're doing something in order to get them to take action. So those people may have more questions. They will want to know the reason, the data and the logic behind the choices that are being made. And some people will really rebel against words like, you need to do this. I need you to do this. This should have been done by now. They're rebels and they will just zone out and switch off to that kind of language. So understanding the tendencies of the people on your team and your stakeholders will really help you to set yourself up for success when you're communicating with people, particularly if you're asking them to take action. So my name is Hayley Watts. I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn. If there's anything we've talked about today or anything you were hoping to get from the session today that you haven't yet, then do please reach out. There is also a link in the chat to Dee's calendar. So if you'd like to have a chat with us about different courses that we run, or perhaps you're interested in our project management or how to be a productivity ninja sessions, then Dee will be able to help answer any of those questions, and you can book a time into her calendar directly from that link there in the chat. Dee, is there anything else to add? Anything I was supposed to say that I haven't around those last few things?